I'm really excited to introduce this panel because we have on the panel people that are today worrying about these issues, worrying about how to build strong transportation systems that not only bring together mobility for people, but also access to opportunity, to the social dimensions, but seeing some of the barriers to that. So what we want to do is explore those barriers, see what's actually happened in real life, and see what the recommendations are going forward. On the panel today, we have Secretary of Transportation of Buenos Aires, Juan Jose Mendez. Secretary Mendez brings 5 or 6 years of experience in the public sector. Before that, he was an entrepreneur and a consultant working on these issues. He and his team put together a sustainable mobility program in Buenos Aires, which won accolades, and has been able to, and will be sharing with us some real-world experiences of some of the triumphs, but also some of the concerns that he brings to the table. We also have Secretary Pollack, who's the Secretary and CEO of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. She brings to us a very deep knowledge of policy issues as a researcher, as a strategic consultant, before moving into government. Again, we'll bring to the conversation both what she knows about what's happening in the world of research, of the world of practitioners, but also what is actually happening in the world of politics in a city, in this state which faces many of the same legacy issues that Adi spoke about. And then finally, we have Professor Gilles Duranton with the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the director of the real estate department, the chair of real estate there, who brings to the conversation research on land issues, and will particularly focus on how those bring to bear on the issues of transportation, but also a lot to talk about silos and about governance issues as we go forward. So with that, I think we're all mic'd, correct? So, and I have a cold, so excuse me for that. I want to, and I hope I'm not giving it to you, I'm going to start with Secretary Mendez. We heard a very compelling presentation about how the world needs to shift towards accessibility. You've been trying to do this in Buenos Aires. Can you give us some sense of what the goals have been in Buenos Aires? What have been some of the successes, but in particular, what have been some of the challenges and barriers to it?
Well, I don't know how many of you are familiarized with the city of Buenos Aires. The city is part of a metropolitan area of 14.5 million inhabitants with 2.5 thousand square meters of area, of kilometers of area. And these 22 million trips per day were historically based on mass transit mainly. The city has a long-standing tradition of mass transit, commuter rails with over 850 kilometers network, bus routes, over 200 bus routes with 18,000 buses running all around the metropolitan area, subway network, not very big, but with 65 kilometers and over 1.2 million riders per day. But in the past 30 years, what we've seen in the city of Buenos Aires, in the metropolitan area, was first of all, there was no coordination at all between the different government levels, the federal government, the Buenos Aires city government, the Buenos Aires state government, and the 42 municipalities, member of this metropolitan area. They weren't coordinating any kind of effort. In the past 8 years, when we start running the city of Buenos Aires with Mayor Macri, which is nowadays the president of Argentina, and now with Mayor Larreta, which is from the same party, we accepted the challenge with the vision to keep or to increase again the service level of mass transit in the city of Buenos Aires, because we've been seeing how the mass transit was losing passengers for car riders, and how the car riders or the car use in the city of Buenos Aires was increasing year after year. So our first challenge was to stop that and to start changing that trends again. Hopefully, we were very successful doing that in the city of Buenos Aires, in our space of governance, these 200 square kilometers we governance, which is the city center of the metropolitan area, but we still miss the interjurisdictional coordination. We couldn't achieve any type of coordination with the federal government. It was just very recently that we could set up a metropolitan transport agency that institutionally was created 4 years ago, but it was December 2015 when Mayor Macri started his presidency with the goal to strengthen and create metropolitan agencies. We started a new period with the Metropolitan Agency, and for the first time, we started coordinating basic things as, for example, mass transit fares. We introduced also to acknowledging that one of the biggest challenges in the city of Buenos Aires are low-income communities. We introduced the social fare, which is a specially discounted fare for low-income population. And right now we are in the coming month, we are launching the intermodal fare, which is also going to help low-income communities. So when we talk about access, what we see is that we have a huge transportation network that it used to be very disconnected. It was not integrated in any way physically, nor in terms of fares. And many of our citizens and neighbors in the metropolitan area were taking a very, very inefficient decisions when they trying to reach their destinations, whatever their reason. And what we are trying to do, and our biggest challenge right now, is to make those decisions more efficient, to allow them. I'm gonna draw it with a quick example. We have some people in the metropolitan area that every day they choose using one bus route that takes you from home to work, and it takes them 1 hour or 70 minutes every day for each trip in this one bus they took every day. Probably, or in many cases, they have other opportunities like using a bus for a short trip and then a train trip that it will take them to their destination in half of the time or maybe 45 minutes, which it looks more efficient, but they don't do it because they have to pay 2 fares. Every time they jump from one mode to the other, they pay an additional fare. And usually people that lives farther away, they are the lower income communities, and it's even, so we are inducing them to very inefficient decisions in terms of mobility and wasting more time because they are not allowed to spend more money. So this is the type of behavior we want to change with this coordination between these 3 different government levels.
Thank you. So what I hear is using the legacy systems, trying to integrate them, but also using as an important lever pricing,
Yes.
both in terms of subsidies as well as just cleaning up some of the anomalies to be able to provide poor people access to opportunity.
Yes.
Let me move to Secretary Pollack. We had a conversation before this, and you gave me some skepticism about whether what you had written about and others in this room and had written about in terms of accessibility as being a major driver for the future and what the reality is in the state of Massachusetts. Can you compare and contrast really what the conversation we're having today with what you find on the ground in Massachusetts?
So I think that in academia, which is where I was until 2 years ago when I became secretary, it is widely accepted that accessibility is a better framework for thinking about the role of transportation in achieving objectives. But transportation agencies are mobility agencies. And they don't wake up every morning and say, I'm a mobility agency, but that's what they're set up to do. So there are at least 4 reasons why it will be difficult to get transportation agencies to reinvent themselves in the way that this conversation sort of presupposes needs to happen. The first I would categorize as culture. Quite frankly, transportation agencies know surprisingly little about the people and places that they serve. You don't need to in order to do the work that we are asked to do. to really be, to live in an accessibility-centric world, you actually have to know, think about Adi's presentation, where people live, where people work, where they get their health care. Most transportation agencies don't know that. And honestly, some people, and I'm not just talking about the folks who work for me, have startlingly little interest in that piece of information, or startlingly little access to that piece of information. So there's a sort of a culture change that you are presupposing that people who came to an agency to do one thing are going to suddenly get interested in a second thing. The second issue you have is what is referred to in the papers as governance. I would call it a span of control issue. If you're serious about accessibility, then the question you ask changes, right? The question is not how to move people. The question is how to support people in gaining access to opportunity. I don't control where the hospital goes in Liverpool. I don't control where affordable housing gets built. I don't control the hours of operation that companies or community colleges or job training programs choose to start earlier in the morning or end later at night than the transit services that my agencies provide. So there's a serious question about whether, if you are serious about accessibility, the transportation department is actually the right part of government to start with. The third thing I would mention briefly is the issue of tools. Transportation agencies do two things, right? They operate, they provide service to customers, and they invest. They figure out which things to build or fix. There are a very limited range of tools that help understand accessibility for both of those things, although I'm happy to talk about examples where folks are starting to use accessibility tools and metrics in both of those areas. But the fundamental tool around which most U.S., not just transportation agencies, but our key planning transportation agencies, which are called metropolitan planning organizations, are built, are regional travel models. And just to maybe help you understand how deeply that tool is a mobility tool and not an accessibility tool, is to think of it this way. In a regional travel model, the output of the tool, the social utility of the thing you are planning for, right, is actually travel. It spits out numbers in trips and miles and movements, right? The inputs to those models are everything that we care about in this room. The inputs are land use and jobs and housing and healthcare and recreational opportunities. If you're serious about accessibility, right, we have to invert that. The output of the tools we use actually needs to be information about access and where healthcare and jobs and housing are or should be in the future. And the input, transportation, is just an input. So the tool issue is a big issue, and that leads to another issue which the papers do talk about, which is we live, my compatriots in the other 49 states in the District of Columbia, since the second to last major federal transportation bill, live in a world driven by performance measurement. That is what the federal government expects us to do. We have to report to them about how we are going to reduce the percentage of our bridge decks that are structurally deficient and improve the condition of our pavement on the interstate highways. If there is no metric, there is no way for me to direct resources to things that is easy. Yet the papers themselves concede that it's not clear. It's clear that there isn't a great singular accessibility metric, and there may never be. So if you want performance-driven, data-driven agencies to change what they do, you have to give them a measurable target to aim toward. And we don't have that for accessibility.
So I think you correctly say this is, you've got a major culture barrier and maybe a governance barrier because of what our departments of transportation actually set up to do. So that leads me to the question is, where should the leadership come from? Is it the mayors? Is it a vision that comes at the state level? Are you seeing at least a demand for that culture change and a demand to opening up the conversation beyond the Department of Transportation in the state of Massachusetts?
So I think there's a couple of issues, right? The demand, I believe, will come from outside the agencies, right? The demand will come from advocates for people to make sure that their needs are met. And there is a question about where that demand should be aimed, right? So a big one is the city level, the metropolitan level, the state level. Those are very different. Mayors, quite frankly, have a lot more tools at their disposal because they have more of a role in the education system, the healthcare system, the land use system, at least in my state, but I think in many US states, than governors do. So I think that is an issue, is sort of how much of the effort. I also, though, think for there to be a conversation that leads to a set of demands that in turn leads to change, we have to find a way to have the conversation. Because, as I said, when I lived in academia and spent my time talking to other academics and went to conferences, it was easy to talk about accessibility, but the way we talk about accessibility, the terminology we use, even in the papers, is not a comfortable terminology. And we need to me, accessibility is a very, very powerful frame for all the things we're trying to achieve, but we haven't actually found the words yet to do that. And the example that I often give, it's a conversation, right, about redefining what the social utility of transportation is. So when I was working on energy issues in the 1970s, that happened. And it happened because a guy named Amory Lovins at the Rocky Mountain Institute was able to explain in a very simple way that people do not care about energy because they care about kilowatts, right? He said people care about energy because they care about heat, light, and power. And that became the mantra. And if you could get heat, light, and power by using less energy or by conserving energy or by tapping the sun, no one cared. The thing they wanted was heat, light, and power, give them heat, light, and power differently, and it really reframed the energy conversation in this country. We talk about transportation, even people who believe in accessibility, when you actually listen to the words they use, in terms of mobility. We assume that movement is actually the social utility provided by the transportation system. The way that you know that this is true, that this is false, right, as false as the belief that the kilowatt is the social utility of the energy system, is how many people do you know who wake up every morning and say, I would like to travel 83.2 miles today? You know none. How many people do you know that wake up and say, I need to get the kids to school, I need to get to work, I need to pick up groceries, and I'd love to go for a run after work? Everyone. The problem is we haven't figured out how to talk about that second thing in a way that is as succinct, as compelling as heat, light, and power.
Thank you. So Gilles, we've heard from people that are in the day-to-day work of transportation. You bring to us the point of view of real estate development, of land use development, of urban development, among others. You have a wide-ranging background. You've worked in Columbia as an advisor. You've worked in many other areas. Does this resonate in terms of some of the barriers? Are we asking the right questions? How do we get the pressure or perhaps the momentum to make those culture changes if it's not going to come from the transportation sector per se? What are the other levers that we might want to use?
Okay, thank you very much. When we started writing this paper with Eric, we started making this silo argument, and we were afraid that we were just from academia. We didn't really live in those agencies, and we didn't really live in city management. So we were very afraid of being or making a big caricature. And then I heard Stephanie, who was like even way worse in her assessments.
Sorry. Really.
So let me start first. I mean, Adair said very rightly that we spend 17% of our disposable incomes on transportation, 95% of which is road transportation. American households also spend an hour 30 each every day going places. So this is 5 to 10% of our time awake. These are extraordinary amounts of resources. And yes, people dealing with that, they come in two different groups. We have the transportation planners who indeed, their main objective is about going faster. And, this is, at some level, this is a very well-laudable goal. I mean, we'd like to be able to go faster. Reaching a given destination faster is important. It matters. At the same time, what is somewhat accessory to the plot in their mind is the fact that when we go places, when we travel, we create all sorts of external effects. We create congestion. We, unfortunately, create accidents. We pollute, and so on and so forth. And this is to the tune of about, 10 cents per mile. These are the best estimates, which means that if we aggregate that to the whole country, this is about $1 billion a day, $1 billion every day. So this is a very large amount of money and resources that we actually lose, and this is sort of secondary to the plot for the transportation planners. The other thing that is really important to realize is if you actually make travel faster, you lower the price. And when the price goes down, I'm an economist, I expect the consumers to be willing to consume more of it. So at some level, this is a good problem to have, but there's a self-defeating aspect here. As you actually improve, as you provide more infrastructure, people will drive more. I think I wrote some interesting things here, or I saw some interesting things here in the data, where basically the amount of traffic on the main roads in this country, highways and principal rail arterials, is basically proportional to the amount of roads of lane kilometers of those roads. So this is there's a self-defeating element here. The other group are land use planners. That's an interesting group. That's culturally indeed a very different group. I mean, the first group were mostly transportation engineers. The others are urban planners, architects. It's a very different sort of culture. And I think they understand indeed that there are some problems with transportation, that it pollutes, that it congests, that it creates accidents and all of this. What they've also realized over the years is that there's no silver bullet. So what I think the direction they took, which I don't really like, is let's make transportation unnecessary by bringing stuff close to people. So I like this idea. The problem is that very often they take it to extremes, and the extreme of that vision is this very middle-aged sort of vision where people will be working on the first floor and live on the second floor. This is just not how we live. This is not just how we live. So this is not going to work. So I like the idea of making stuff closer, because going faster is one idea, but making stuff closer is indeed another idea. The problem is that they never do that together, so there's no coordination. Whenever I go to a policy discussion about this, there's always a smart person who says, oh, but we need a more holistic approach. I really hate that word. I really hate that word, because then we quickly go into some mumbo-jumbo, and we're losing both the discipline of transportation planners and the discipline of urban planners, and we enter in some world where it's not working very well, and people will not do great things. So indeed, we need to recognize that this is about both distances and speed and ease of transportation. So do I have a plan of action? I think there are some low-hanging fruits here. A lot of this country is zoned what we call in the jargon Euclidean, i.e. one big area, one use, pure residential, pure commercial, pure retail. Yes, we don't want noxious land use in residential areas. I don't want a chemical factory next to my house. But beyond that, there's a big argument about mixed use, or at least maybe not always try to rapidly foster it like some people would like to do, but at least making sure if we want to have mixed use, we can actually have it. Then there's another thing that makes us travel long distances in this country, it's minimum lot size. A lot of the suburbs in this country are zoned half an acre, quarter of an acre, 3/4, 1 full acre, and sometimes even more. And individually, we may not want to consume that much land. We actually make that zoning for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with transportation. That's going to be really hard to get rid of that one, because this is what actually will govern the way we choose locations so that our kids can go to good schools. We don't want the riffraff to come to nice places. So that's the way we actually exclude people, by forcing them to consume very large amounts of land. But in terms of transportation, this is self-defeating. This is making us travel way more than we should. The third thing I want to talk about is, indeed, we need more science. I mean, that was sort of transparent in your speech. I know this is not the right place to talk about more science, and certainly not the right week, as the flat earthers are actually going to take over. But we still need actually to think to do more science. Accessibility, I think in simple words, is about where people choose to go relative to where they could have chosen to go. So it means, and there are questions before this one, which is, their choice of motorization, whether or not to buy a car, their residential choices, and so on and so forth. But this is really, again, where people choose to go, given where they could have gone, given the opportunities that they face. So the Department of Transportation has a nice survey. I think the next wave is coming live very soon, where indeed we observe where people go to. We have now with the technology actually that allows us to also understand where they could have gone to. So we know that so-and-so on that day decided to go to the restaurant at 7 p.m., whatever, 6 miles away from home. He could have gone to, or she could have gone to a restaurant only 2 miles or 7 miles. We actually now have the data to be able to actually analyze those choices and make progress on that. So it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, but I think we can make progress. So despite what the flat earthers, yet it moves indeed. So somebody said that many centuries ago, and moving indeed is not utility in itself, but it's actually what allows us to live reasonable and interesting lives.
So let me turn to Secretary Mendez to pose this question. When we talk about these new ways of thinking about land use and the like, we also see sort of the underbelly, the negative underbelly, which is gentrification, which is increased access to transportation, increasing land values, which are then pushing people out to further away from access to transportation. You have some interesting work going on, or at least have seen some of this going on in the south side of Buenos Aires, where you've got low-income communities that are increasingly being pushed out of the city and increasingly pushed out away from transportation networks, access to the goods and services that they need. What are the dynamics that are working there, not just on the transportation side, but on the land use side and the real estate side? And what's the city doing about it?
Well, the situation of the southern neighborhood of the city of Buenos Aires, it took a holistic approach from the city government in terms that we had to join efforts of our department, transport planning, with urban planning and economic development at the city government. And for example, when we introduced the southern corridor of the BRT, the Metrobus, in the southern neighborhoods of the city, we didn't face the typical capacity problem that usually arises, and the response is a BRT. But the BRT addressed other issues like accessibility to mass transit. The bus routes were operating in terms of speed and capacity very well, but the quality of services was very poor. So introducing the BRT stations with the renewal of the public space, the reclaiming of the public space for better uses and higher quality, improved the quality of the neighborhoods. Also, the urban planning department and the economic development department, they introduced the creation of a specific development area for IT companies, reducing taxes and inducing those companies to move to the southern neighborhoods of Buenos Aires and start mixing activities. It used to be only a residential neighborhood with some businesses related to logistic practices. We create a logistic center to move those isolated practices around the neighborhood into a logistic facility. And then those spaces are now being reconverted into offices or new houses for these new businesses that are coming to the neighborhoods, which are also better connected than it used to be in the past. And this approach was very helpful, but it didn't fulfill all our requirements in terms of integrating low-income communities. We have slums in Buenos Aires, very big slums, and regulated settlements of low-income neighbors that we're now addressing in terms of integrating them to the city. And the process of integration is also require a holistic approach. It's not only opening roads and getting transportation into these new neighborhoods, but also really develop the redevelopment in terms of land use and the quality of infrastructure. They really deserve to be a neighborhood and to have the same standard of the rest of the city. Right now, neighbors of these slums are spending more money in real terms than the rest of the neighbors of the city. Because usually the last mile or the last 1.5 or 2 kilometers to the regular or the mass transit system is served by some type of private unregulated transportation supply that is very expensive, is sometimes unsafe because it's not regulated, is performing very poorly. And in order to access to the city and to what the city has to offer, they have to spend more money. So we had to address that situation also in order to connect these neighborhoods with the existing mass transit network. So
Wonderful to see that actually, notwithstanding holistic, there is actually an example where the cities come together from the various points of view. So it gives a little bit of hope that this can happen. I haven't been able to ask questions on finances, on fiscal, on public-private partnerships, on metrics. There's so many things that we can cover because now it's time for the audience. So we have about 10 minutes for audience questions. I'd ask you to please keep it very short, to please introduce yourself. If there's a specific person you're addressing the question to, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll open up to the panel. I'm going to take a few questions, and then we'll round it through. So please raise your hands, and let me see. I have this gentleman right front here.
Hi, Steve Kaplan. Am I right? The Buenos Aires bus system is largely or uses private bus companies in its mass transit. My question is there a place for private ownership and management of mass transit in urban environments?
Okay, well, we'll take a few questions. Other questions? Way in the back.
Ma'am, take the microphone, please.
Like a community.
Yes, thank you.
We are a community of intellectuals and thinkers here. So
Can you introduce yourself, please?
my name is Maureen. I'm taking my doctorate in nursing in Rutgers University.
Thank you.
And I do FMCA, Certified Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration Medical Examiner. My question is, we're a group of intellectuals here. The bottom line is, when you talk to the public, the first question is, it's traffic. George Washington Bridge, Garden State Parkway, Atlantic City Expressway. So how do we fix traffic? Because it affects our quality of life. When we go to Vienna, Austria, Germany, they have excellent transport system. What is wrong with the United States that we can fix it?
Thank you very much. Yes?
Hi, thank you. My name is Emmy Kalawale. I run a human-centered design consultancy called Design LLC. I was wondering, is it a storytelling problem that is happening here? I hear a lot about we need data collection, we need to know more data, but it also sounds like the story about transportation is being told badly, if it's even being told at all. And I'm wondering, is this a storytelling problem or a data problem? Or is it a combination of both, and which one comes first?
One more question here.
Lynn Scholl from the Inter-American Development Bank. My question is about the discounted fare for poor populations. How does that work? How do you identify the poor? How does the targeting work? And how can we do that in other cities and developing countries? Because often it's hard to figure out who are the poor because there aren't easy ways to target. So I'm wondering how the discount works.
Thank you so much. Let's turn back to our panelists. Secretary Mendez, I'll ask you to perhaps reflect on on the issue of privatization, of private ownership of mass transit, but particularly, does it help or not help? Does it make your life more complicated or less complicated when you're trying to fix this or to have an accessibility-led transportation system?
Well, in this long-standing tradition of mass transit in the city of Buenos Aires, the private sector always played a key role in the development of the system. Subway lines, they were promoted by private companies at the beginning, and the same happens with the bus routes. And we've been having private operators like for many years now, and even though we changed the first schemes till the end of the 90s, the first were covered 100% by passengers. Now they are subsidized by the federal government. If you set the right incentives private operators tend to be very efficient and tend to be a very important part of the equation. So for us, it was very useful to have them, although we had so many issues and discussions along the way, but it was very helpful. This is a system of 18,000 buses and almost 200 bus routes, which is very, very broad and hard to manage. And in terms of how we recognize or we work to offer social fare to low-income communities, the federal government administration for social benefits like pensions, and they have specific programs for assistance to low-income communities. And in those programs, they already, in the past 12 to 13 years, they've been working very hard identifying these communities in order to grant them assistance. So we have one fare collection system that is called SUBE, and it's available for the entire mass transit system. And what we did in the past year was to introduce into the SUBE card the social fare specific, I don't know how to say, but we introduced in the SUBE card the social fare program, and they only have to link the SUBE card with their income or taxes identification number, and they automatically receive the social fare discount. It was very easy for the mass transit system because this federal administration was working very properly in the past 10 years, identifying the low-income communities.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Secretary Pollock and Professor Duranton to tell us about the storytelling. We read in the papers, or those of you, I refer to one of the excellent papers in this series that talked about how difficult it is to find metrics and to find common denominators and common definitions and the like. So that's a bit of the data piece. Is that really a fundamental problem, or is it the problem that Secretary Pollock raised, which is we're just not telling this story right? We're not capturing people, we don't have a narrative. So it's probably a bit of both, but Secretary Pollock.
I do think it is a bit of both, and I think that, so in public policy, we tend to call telling a story right framing. So what we're talking about is moving from a frame called mobility to a frame called accessibility, right? And so words matter, right? So when we make the statement, right, the way I describe to my staff, what do we do? What does my agency do? I say we help people get where they need to go safely and reliably. Now, that's not a bad frame, but it's a mobility frame. And you know that it is because I use the words get, go, and where, right? In an accessibility frame, what we actually should be in the business of doing is helping people get what they need. It's not a where, right? It's not a move. It's a get what they need. Now, that doesn't take mobility out of the picture, right? Because honestly, even in an accessibility world, the number one tool for achieving accessibility is still going to be movement, right? You go to your job. You go to your children's school. But what reframing it and sort of changing the narrative, and again, using words that make sense to people, not academics, is it opens up a set of tools. So I'll very briefly just mention this. And this actually goes to the privatization question. For the mobility piece of accessibility, for those things that people need access to that require movement, we live in a wonderful time in the transportation world because there are so many more mobility options, and many of them are privately provided, right? We did not have Uber. We did not have Lyft. We did not have bike sharing. We did not have cars to go. Those are all mobility tools with the potential to increase accessibility. And it is a good thing, not a bad thing, that the private sector is providing some of them because it allows the public sector to focus on other things. So mobility still matters, and the private sector can be a huge provider of mobility. In the field now, it's being called mobility on demand, and that is a good thing, not a bad thing. We need more of it. But the interesting thing about accessibility is mobility is you've done a ways, an ends and means shift, right? So in a mobility world, the end is movement. In an accessibility world, the end is getting what you need. And one way of doing that, so the easy example to think about which is an accessibility and a social equity issue, is there's a family with very little money that lives in a neighborhood where there is no fresh produce available to them to eat a healthy diet. In an accessibility world, you have at least 3 ways of helping that family. And again, in the transportation agency, telling them that that's part of their job is to figure out how to help that family get access to affordable, healthy food comes as a surprise. But if you accept that that's actually an accessibility objective, a mobility answer is to subsidize travel so they can get to wherever the fresh groceries is. That's a mobility answer. Or to have a new provider, including a private provider, come in and provide a connection to the grocery store, or for the grocery store itself to realize that there is a market and move people. That's the mobility answer. The moving stuff closer is usually referred to as a proximity answer, right? So that's putting grocery stores in food deserts. Again, not seen as a transportation function, but clearly an accessibility thing. So that's proximity. And then the third thing, and again, we live in an age where this is so possible, right, is you stay exactly where you are and things come to you. I don't know that we have a great name for that one yet. We need to tell that story. But in Boston, it consists of a group of students at a college who graduated, bought a bus, outfitted it with racks, go and buy produce, and they drive it around like what I remember from my childhood is as the bookmobile. So in low-income neighborhoods in Boston, produce appears. And so the people stay, but the thing they need moves to them, not on a permanent basis, which is proximity by opening the store. So that's why, to me, this telling the story differently is so exciting, because as soon as you live in an accessibility world, there are so many more solutions to the problems that we all care so much about.
So let me, final word to Professor Dorantin-de Gilles. Metrics, is it the storytelling or the metrics? We heard quite a bit about the storytelling side. Is there still room for metrics? And very quickly, because we're about to move on to our next section.
Well, I'm going to be certainly biased. I mean, I live in academia, and I actually really enjoy working with the metrics. So I'm going to be biased on that one. What I don't like about the storytelling is that it's presented more and more in this country, and certainly in other well-advanced countries, in terms of war on car, where you have those 2 factions, for or against, which actually goes back to the 2 silos that we've talked about before. So I don't think, well, this debate is very well productive, so I'm trying to go beyond that. And there's lots more options, but there's also new ideas and new things that are developed in other parts of the world that we should be looking at. And BRT in Buenos Aires, which actually started in Curitiba, well, Brazil, was adopted, well, massively, well, in Bogota. This is an extraordinary system. So I don't know. I mean, I've been well to Buenos Aires several times, and I'll be back next month, but I know well Bogota very well. So this is a transportation system that is actually moving around more people than the London Underground in terms of passenger miles. So this is an extraordinary system, and all this is for the cost of 5 or 6 miles of New York subway at the current tune. So this is, well, a system that is actually extraordinarily well impressive. So they can clock one large-scale bus, well, every minute or less. Last time, I spoke to a transportation planner that was in Vancouver, and the guy was so proud that he could get a bus every 90 seconds. And I thought, yeah, but in Bogota, it's 55 seconds. So there's lots of ideas, there's lots of practices that actually elsewhere in the world, and the big novelty here is that the developing world is making big headways for lots and lots of things.
Maybe that answers a bit of our question on traffic and what's going on in other countries. I want you all to join me in thanking our panelists, Secretary Mendez, Secretary Pollack, Professor Dorantin.